Be strong.
Suddenly, Timur appears and shelters the mom and baby from the huge bug approaching her. He hits it with tremendous force. The mother with the child in her arms sits on the ground and looks at Timur with gratitude. At this time, Timur bites the insect with his huge mouth. A green liquid flows from the beetle's body. Other angry bugs swoop down on Timur, a rhinoceros beetle and another bug that looks like a huge fly. They try to sting him, but Timur mercilessly hits them with his huge paws so that they fly apart. Many precise strikes with the sharp sword cut the insect bodies in half. Nickel swings his sword, leaving them no chance of escape. The cut parts of the insects' bodies fly off in different directions. There is a brutal massacre between the insects, Andreas's helpers Nickel and Timur. The surviving leopards also continue to fight, defending their village. An unknown man hides behind a huge tree, quietly observing the battlefield from the sidelines. Rannox looks on, perplexed, and ponders who he is. He realizes full well that defeat awaits him. Rannox looks furious and confused. He didn't expect this turn of events. He was just looking for mortal sins on Mr. Jester's orders. He knocks himself out and realizes that he's going to have to get out of here somehow. Hiding behind a rock, he watches frustratedly as his favorite bugs die on the battlefield. When he turns around, he sees an unknown person standing in front of him, poking his shoulder with his sharp sword. He is taken aback by the surprise. The masked Andreas stuck his sword into his shoulder. He knew that Rannox was somewhere nearby, watching. Angry Rannox is only interested in who dares to interfere with him? He loudly asks Andreas how he knows him? Wincing in pain, Rannox holds onto his wounded shoulder and tells Andreas that if he's a dark mage too, he has no reason to attack him. Andreas quickly shuts him up and tells him that he's asking questions here. Staring intently at Ronex, Andreas angrily asks him about seeking mortal sins on Jackster's orders. Ronex opens his mouth in surprise and asks Andreas how he knew that. Andreas sternly tells him to answer his question, or he will cut off his hand. At this point, he senses something and thinks that maybe he should poke him some more. Ronex doesn't answer his question. He listens in horror to the fact that Andreas knows all about him. Andreas tells him that apparently he wanted to get his hands on the lunapult crystal and attack the leopards because he thought their treasure was one of the deadly sins. Andreas keeps pointing his sword at him. He sternly advises him to think carefully before giving an answer, for he may die right now, or he may tell him everything. The enraged Rannox realizes that he has no choice and that he will have to tell everything to stay alive. Andreas tries to hurry him up, threatening him that if he refuses to talk, he will regard it as a death wish. Rannox begins to lose his temper and screams that he will tell everything. Rannox holds out a sheet of notes to Andreas and says that this is their list of possible mortal sins, and adds that it's not entirely accurate. Andreas says he'll be sure to check it out. Andreas keeps his promise and moves his sword away from Rannox. He exhales with relief. Andreas scrutinizes the sheet Rannox gave him. His attention is drawn to the unusual image, which shows a strange object. He notes that he is seeing it for the first time. The picture shows mystical treasures from the deep sea to be placed in Muriel's auction. Andreas notes that this thing is most like a mortal sin and, crumpling the sheet, tucks it into his cloak pocket. The harbor town of Muriel is located on the shore of the reservoir. Several ships with white parkas stand near the shore. This is Andreas's next target. Rannox looks pityingly into Andreas's eyes and asks him if he will spare him. A chilling sword slips across his neck. Andreas coolly thanks the old man for the useful information and tucks his sword back into his belt. Rannox's dead body falls to the ground. Andreas decides to take his body for experimentation. The dead body lies on the cold ground. There is not much time left before the auction. Andreas decides to go to Muriel as soon as he gets home. The clear blue sky shows dark smoke rising from the ground. In a rescued village, the surviving leopards view their dead enemies, huge insects. The village elder approaches Andreas, holding a valuable lettuce crystal, and thanks him for saving the village. She says they can't pay him properly, so she suggests he take the lunapult crystal. Andreas kindly refuses to take it and explains to her that he is not interested. The elder asks him what he is interested in then. Without hesitating for a second, Andreas points to the cave behind him and says that he would very much like to go in there. He asks the elder for permission to go in. She and the few leopards behind her stare at him in surprise, eyes wide. The leopards look amongst themselves and are upset that it turns out he needs a mind too. They are once again convinced that humans can't be trusted. The wise elder lowers her head down, closing her eyes, and sighs deeply. Continuing to hold the large crystal in her hands, she graciously allows Andreas to step inside the cave. One of the leopards behind her tries to contradict her, explaining that whatever debt they owe him is... The elder casts a reproachful look at him and tells him that if it weren't for this man, their village would have been destroyed and there would be no mine or anything else left. Andreas stands silently in front of her and waits. Andreas tries to calm them down, explaining that he didn't come for the crystals. They all stand staring at him, puzzled. Then the elder tries to ask him what he came here for. Andreas looks at the entrance to the cave and assures them that he will be sure to explain everything inside it, for there is something there that he needs very badly. Inside the cave, walking a little deeper, a green, sparkling light can be seen. Andreas, Timur, and the elder, with two of his cronies, walking down the deep, gloomy corridor of the cave. Andreas stops at the wall and touches it, trying to feel something. He feels that somewhere in here is what he needs. The leopards look puzzled at what he is doing. The elder does not understand what he wants to find, for there is just a wall. Andreas, not heeding the words spoken to him by the elder, orders Timur to break down this wall. Timur is ready to proceed with the order without further question and growls loudly. At the same second, he hits the wall with tremendous force, punching it through. A lot of splinters fly from the wall in different directions. The elder looks at Timur with admiration and is amazed at the terrifying power he has. The leopards behind the elder tell her that it is dangerous to be here and that they need to go outside immediately. She stands there, ignoring the words, watching in amazement. What they see behind the broken wall shocks them. Lots of crystals are on the ceiling, walls, and floor. There are an infinite number of them. Everyone is standing with their mouths wide open. The elder understands why Andreas came here. He wants all those crystals. She angrily tells him so. Andreas turns his head in her direction. He tells her that he is well aware of how valuable they are, but as he assured her, he doesn't need them. The elder doesn't settle down, trying to figure out what he needs then. Andreas points his hand to the huge statue behind him and says that is exactly what he needs. The elder stares at him perplexed, not believing his ears. The leopards standing nearby are just as surprised. Andreas coldly repeats that he is the one he wants. A huge statue of a monster made of stone stands poised on a sword. The elder interrogates him about needing a statue. Continuing to marvel at everything that is happening, the elder stands with his mouth wide open. Andreas walks closer to the statue. The elder wonders why there is such a huge thing here in the cave. They all continue to scrutinize the monster statue. Andreas turns to the leopards and says that he will leave all the crystals to them, but in return he needs them to leave him here alone. Trying to find out what he needs it for, the elder tries to object. She explains that she is the head of the tribe, and she should know. Andreas, in a calm voice, tries to reassure her that they have nothing to worry about, and if he wanted to hurt them, he would have done it already. One of the leopards is outraged beyond belief. Grinning, he shouts to Andreas that although he is their savior, it is unacceptable to ask for this. The elder immediately besieges him, preventing him from getting any closer to Andreas. The elder puts her hand to her chest and calmly tells Andreas that he will not take them by force, so she trusts him, but the leopards standing next to her are in complete shock at the words she hears. Andreas looks at her gratefully without interrupting. She asks him to consider the fact that he is the first person they have made a promise to. Andreas is left alone with the huge statue. He exhales with relief and rejoices that at last he is alone. Andreas immediately decides to get down to business. He thinks that since the statue is no longer flesh, it would be better to turn him into a ghoul. Andreas begins the ritual. He exalts the emerald magic ball with one hand. It floats above his hand without touching it. An electronic scoreboard appears. It reads that initial necromancy is taking place, the summoning of a gull. One corpse has been discovered right now. After a while, the electronic scoreboard writes that Andreas has an insufficient caster level. Andreas frustratedly realizes that he has failed, but he does not give up hope and resolves to repeat the ritual as long as it takes. The electronic scoreboard reads that the initial necromancy has failed and that the gull's summoning has failed. Andreas throws off his robes. He knew it wouldn't work out that easily. Andreas is adopting a determined posture. He is absolutely confident in his abilities. No matter how long it takes, he will definitely make the monster his own. Performing the ritual once again, nothing happens to the statue. It still stands motionless. The electronic scoreboard again reads that Andreas has an insufficient caster level. The magic crystals in the cave also remain stationary. The electronic scoreboard reads that the initial necromancy did not occur. The gull's summoning failed. Millions of lettuce crystals shine and shimmer brightly. The electronic scoreboard once again writes that Andreas has an insufficient caster level. Next, the scoreboard writes that initial necromancy failed again. Ghoul summoning failed again. Everything repeats in a circle, but Andreas does not give up hope for a positive outcome. The electronic scoreboard still reads that the initial necromancy failed again, and the ghoul's summoning failed again. A frustrated Andreas wipes the sweat off his forehead. There's no way he's going to give up. Andreas leans in front of the statue and thinks about the fact that he has been trying for over a week now, but nothing has worked. He begins to think that maybe he should give up. But immediately, he dismisses those thoughts. He realizes that others know about this place now, and there is no guarantee that the giant will be here the next time he returns. His gaze grows more determined and confident. Andreas decides to try and increase his mana, all or nothing. He looks extremely serious and focused, holding a magic ball above his hand. The electronic scoreboard reads that initial necromancy, gull summoning, is taking place. One corpse is discovered. A rune is depicted on the magic ball. Andreas clenches his fingers tightly. Drops of sweat dripped from his face, his eyebrows furrowed, his gaze focused. He still has time. He looks at the huge frozen statue, which still continues to stand as it is, unmoving. Andreas decides to definitely keep trying until he succeeds. A long-awaited information appears on the electronic scoreboard. The initial necromancy is taking place. Ghoul summoning is successful. Andreas looks as focused as possible. He can't believe how well he's doing. It is further written that Andreas was summoned by the mythical Gull Titan. Trace writes that the corpse level is very high, added status traits. At that moment, a layer of stone begins to slowly fall off the monster's huge paws. Living hands with ugly nails begin to appear. The electronic scoreboard reads that the corpse's level is over the limit, its rank is raised. The monster becomes a Ghoul Titan champion. The monster comes fully to life. His face wrinkles, his teeth grind. A layer of stone falls off his body. The electronic scoreboard reads that the level of the finished body is almost transcending. The monster is regaining some of its former ego. Standing in front of Andreas is an animated monster ghoul. He is of such a huge size that Andreas is very small in comparison. He is in great shape, muscular and very healthy. His eyes are burning bright red. Andreas looks down at him admiringly. The electronic scoreboard says that the undead monster is at mythic level. It has gained some of the traits it had before its death. His face is wrinkled, his jaw is clenched. He looks very bloodthirsty and scary. His eyes continue to burn. The scoreboard says that the mythical Gull Titan is the champion. His name is Rudrudal Kanu Dondo. He is a rank 6 undead. His mana is 3,733. His special traits are ego, monstrous strength, fighting spirit, and indomitability. The Gull Titan takes his sharp sword in his huge paw and pulls it out of the ground. Andreas watches him admiringly. The monster sits down on one knee and ducks his head. He looks at Andreas with devoted eyes. Andreas notes that he looks very intimidating. With a smile on his face, Andreas thinks about the fact that he is now the only one who can control a member of the giant tribe. He is glad that he can no longer fear a large number of enemies. He thanks God that his efforts have paid off. An ominous castle with 3 sharp peaks inspires terror. It is a deep, dark night outside. In the sky, you can see a bright moon overlaid by clouds. Mr. Jester is sitting in pitch darkness in one of the rooms of the castle reading a book. There is a transparent jar with a lid on the table. There is a black fly sitting on the wall of the jar and beating on it. It's like it's mad. As it continues to bang against the wall of the jar, in an instant it simply disintegrates into small particles. Jester is watching carefully. He looks at the fly, which has just died. Mr. Jester immediately figures out what this is all about. He realizes that Rannox is dead. He remembers old Ranix and doesn't get too upset because it's not that big of a deal. He still has plenty of pawns after all. Suddenly, a huge black raven flies in and addresses Jester. He turns to look at it. The raven tells him that His Royal Majesty wants to see him. With a calm visage, Jester tells the raven to tell him that he will come to him right away. Jester looks at the booklet with the list of sins. He's just had a report for His Royal Majesty. On a cliff is a small hut in total abandonment. There is not a single soul around except the owner of the hut. On the wooden floor sits the same Deshroon to whom Andreas was sent by Mr. Bach Alwyn. He is staring off into the distance. Holding a large potato in his hand without turning back, he asks someone about being sent by the Empire. His gaze is frowning. Not far behind him, holding on to a tree, Andreas stands and scrutinizes him. He is surprised that Deshroon has been able to sense his presence. Deshroon turns his head slightly and glances at Andreas. He is perfectly calm and poised. Andreas guiltily holds out the envelope with the letter to Deshroon and tries to explain to him that he has come on Duke Alwyn's recommendation. Mr. Deshroon looks at him angrily, slightly surprised that Bach Alwyn sent him. His eyebrows frown slightly. Andreas draws his sword and points it at Deshroon. He in turn stands absolutely calm and serene. Andreas holds his sword in his hands and looks at Deshroon seriously. He feels something that presses him even more than Salem does. He can't believe that this is a test. Deshroon stands, unmoving, holding a crooked stick behind his back and asks Andreas what's the matter. Did he say he could attack? He looks absolutely sure of himself and his words. Andreas looks at Deshroon with incomprehension. He is surprised that he is going to fight him with a stick. He realizes that Deshroon does not take him seriously. This angers Andreas even more, and he moves lightning fast from where he was just standing. He is absolutely certain that he will defeat him for sure. Andreas jumps up, holding his sharp sword in his hands. At this time, Deshroon stares at him, unmoving. He waits to see what Andreas will do next. Andreas swings his sword, and Deshroon skillfully dodges it, leaning back. Andreas's gaze is focused and sullen. Deshroon moves closer to Andreas, trying to hold on to the hand he is holding the sword with, and says that it has become clear to him approximately what he is able to do. He deftly grabs Andreas by the wrist of the hand that holds his sword and catches it away. He tells him about how he needs to train in something other than fencing, as he has an unconvincing fighting style where he relies too much on subterfuge. Deshroon abruptly grabs his arm and lifts Andreas off the ground. Out of surprise, Andreas cries out. Deshroon explains to him that his movements are too obvious and he relies too much on speed. Deshroon smiles slyly as he holds Andreas weightless and looks at him with rather kind eyes. He tries to explain his mistakes to him in the most correct way possible. He goes on to explain to him that he can't see his opponent's intentions. Andreas looks at him fearfully and doesn't utter a single word. Andreas falls to the ground with a clatter. He wrinkles his nose in pain. At that moment, Deshroon explains to him that Andreas is doing all these things because of his lack of experience. Andreas is lying on the ground unmoving. Deshroon stands by his side nonchalantly and tells him in a calm voice not to worry about anything. He promises him that he'll get better as long as he plays with him. It is the first day of training on Mount Clayton. Andreas attacks Deshroon, who defends himself against him with two simple wooden sticks. He looks unperturbed. The 7th day of training is coming. There is a large bowl of kaftafel on the table. Deshroon and Andreas are eating boiled potatoes. It is the 15th day of training. Andreas deftly performs an exercise with suspended logs. He feels them perfectly. Suddenly, his sharp sword with a golden hilt falls to the grass with a clatter. It is the 22nd day of training. Deshroon grabs Andreas by the throat with his huge hand and lifts him up. Andreas, panting and drooling, begs him to give him a little break. It is the 27th day of training. Andreas looks more calm and centered. His physical condition has improved a lot. He now works out with his torso bare and his hair in a ponytail. The 33rd day of training comes. Andreas and Deshroon are fighting each other. Deshroon is already holding a huge sword instead of wooden sticks. Andreas's sword strokes are more confident and calculated. He wields it skillfully. Deshroon, during the fight, observes his ward closely and concludes that he has gotten much better at moving, but Andreas approaches Deshroon with his back to him, sword in hand. At that moment, distracted from the fight, Deshroon loses his guard for a moment. Without thinking, Deshroon hits him in the stomach with his powerful elbow. Andreas cried out in pain. Andreas flies off from the jolt. At this moment, Deshroon is thinking that thinking in the middle of a fight is too naive. Deshroon swings his legs out and lands a crushing blow that sends Andreas flying backwards and falling a great distance. Deshroon, after taking a little breath, looks at Andreas with satisfied eyes and says that he recognizes his will to fight, as he has never once complained. Deshroon's gaze changes abruptly. He is surprised at what he sees before him. His brow furrows, one eye squinting. Andreas assumes an attacking posture as if nothing had happened, with his legs spread wide. His sword is still in his hands. Andreas gives Deshroon a sly look and tells him that even Master Sword can let his guard down, and that next time he won't hold back. Andreas lies on the grass, curled up. Deshroon watches him from the side and thinks about the fact that, though not skillfully, he has now gathered his aura and sent it flying. He didn't realize that he was already good enough to use the sword arts. Deshroon becomes very frowning and thoughtful. He is very interested in the fact that Andreas applied this method instinctively or not. Andreas's talent is beyond his expectations. He remembers one of his students, a dark-haired, blue-eyed boy named Luis. Andreas reminds him a lot of him. He, too, had said he was going to join Rodlin soon. An idea pops into his head to put them in sparring matches with each other. It's a warm summer day. There is not a single cloud in the sky. Green leaves rustle in the breeze. A warm summer day is in full swing. Andreas opens his eyes abruptly and doesn't immediately realize where he is. He shrieks in surprise. He turns his head to the right and sees Deshroon sitting on the cliff of the mountain, who asks him about finally waking up. The man glares at him and asks him about whether he can repeat the sword art he used before he passed out. Andreas is holding his head. He hits the ground hard with it. He interrogates him about that thing he did before they made a chop out of him. Andreas gets up from the ground and says that he is just desperate at this point. Deshroon asks to be allowed to use this opportunity to teach him how to use the sword arts, and at one time the basic skills of aura control. Green leaves sway gently in the wind. The sky is a soft blue color. It's warm outside. Deshroon walks over to a huge tree. At this point, he explains to Andreas about how when he wants to use the sword art, he needs to visualize that he is creating a sheath from his aura around the blade. Andreas looks at him carefully. Deshroon pulls out his huge sword from the sheath on his belt and goes on to say that he must then send these scabbards flying. With deft sword movements, he chops a tree trunk into several pieces in a fraction of a second without much effort. Andreas watches admiringly with his lips pressed together. He is absolutely amazed at his strength and power. Deshroon explains to Andreas in a calm voice that although this is the basic form of a sharp blade, it can be used in a variety of ways, from explosions to shockwave. Andreas is amazed that he was able to chop down such a huge tree so easily. Deshroon steps closer to Andreas and folds his arms across his chest. He teaches him that when he will apply the aura, he needs to stimulate his body, not his sword. Andreas turns his back to him. You can see the doubt in his eyes that he, too, is capable of such a thing. Deshroon continues to explain to him that then he will be able to move at incredible speeds, as he is now. Andreas asks loudly about when this is going to happen. Deshroon laughs and explains to him that the mystic aura technique is the basis of aura application, and it's built on the same theory he just showed him. Trying to get through to Andreas finally, Deshroon smiles and goes on to explain that he needs to surround his body or sword with an aura and put the right amount of power into them. He reminds him that he still has a long way to go. Deshroon tells Yepim to learn the art of the sword for the time being. Andreas, without delay, gets down to business. Deshroon praises him and tells him to keep at it, and as he gets used to it, tells him to move a little farther away. Andreas deftly swings his sword and approaches the huge tree. An electronic scoreboard slowly appears in front of him. He waits attentively to see what it says. The scoreboard says that all conditions have been met and an object for evolution has been found. The chance of increasing his battle talent is 30%. He is prompted to apply it. He didn't expect his battle skill to reach the next level. Andreas continues to perform sword strokes. He is happy with the way it happened. Besides, he likes this way of training his body better. He makes several precise and powerful strokes on the thick tree trunk. Deschron looks on dumbfounded. He didn't expect Andreas to learn it so quickly. He looks closely at the focused Andreas and realizes that he is even better than he thought. He would never have thought that such talent existed. Images of those who had also mastered these skills pop into his mind, but Wulg, Luis, and even he weren't that skilled. Deschron watches with approval as Andreas gets the hang of things. He realizes that if he is pointed in the right direction, he can grow on his own. He decides that, in that case, he can only... At this point, Deschron tells Andreas that that is enough for today and calls him to go home. He tells him to dig up the potatoes and boil them. At the end, he calls him his apprentice. Andreas freezes and looks at him in surprise. Frustrated and sullen, Andreas goes off to do as he is told. He goes and mutters to himself that he has to eat the same thing every time, and he has a feeling that soon potatoes will be growing out of his body. Suddenly, something comes to him. He didn't immediately realize the way Deschron had just called him He turns to Deschron and asks him about the fact that he just called him his apprentice. Deschron slowly moves away from him. Andreas manages to tell him that he doesn't mean that. Deschron and Andreas sit silently at a low table outside eating potatoes. Andreas gobbles and ponders why Deschron accepted him as an apprentice, even though he had spent over a month with him. At that moment, he notices that the teacher is holding out some ancient book to him. Andreas looks at it, puzzled. Holding an ancient book in his hands, Deschron holds it out to Andreas and offers it to him. He tells him that he wrote it while he was in these mountains. Andreas holds the book in his hands in surprise, and stammering slightly asks Deschron about why he is giving it to him. An electronic board appears in front of him, and it says that this book is called Sword Without Ego, which is a skill book. It is written by Deschron Formn and contains deep knowledge about his swordsmanship style. Andreas holds an ancient book in his hands and scrutinizes it. Andreas stares at the book with his mouth wide open. He can't believe that he has a Deschron skill book in his hands. This is the very item that helps raise the level, just like Morn's dark magic book. Deschron looks extremely serious. He wields his sword so skillfully. Andreas concludes that with this book he will be able to master the sword just like Deschron, without ego. Andreas sits and stares at the book in silence. Deschron looks at him carefully and waits for some kind of reaction. Laughing loudly, he asks Andreas about the fact that he is so disgusted that he is the one being taught. Andreas replies guiltily that it wasn't like that at all. He was simply speechless at such a valuable gift. Deschron closes his eyes and tries to convey to Andreas with a serious look that he would like to directly mentor potential students, but sometimes too much guidance can ruin talent. They are sitting at the table. Deschron goes on to say that Andreas has a special talent and his body is full of aura. That's why he wants him to use his book as a guide to find his training method. Andreas can't believe his ears. Andreas holds the book tightly with both hands. This time he was finally convinced that the sword master had truly accepted him as his apprentice. Rising from his seat, Deschron tells him that since he is done with his training, it might be time for him to leave these mountains, because if he stays here too long, his skills will dull. Andreas continues to sit on his knees and wondered at him about where he would go. Deschron looks up at the sky and says that he will be traveling to the Southern Kingdom Alliance. Andreas replies frustratedly that he needs to go in a completely different direction. But he asks very much to be allowed to walk him as far as possible, calling Deschron a teacher. A lonely young hungry guy wanders through the forest in pitch darkness. Just a little bit more, and his strength will completely run out. He has been walking exhausted for a long time and doesn't even know how long he has been walking. He looks extremely tired. He carries a huge sword on his back. His arms are bandaged up to his elbows. He is walking with barely a footstep. The only thing that stays in his head is the thought of his grandfather and everyone from the village. Of all of them, he is the only one left alive. His face wrinkles, a little more, and he cries. From helplessness and hopelessness, he falls to the ground. He does not know what to do next and how to live. Terrible clouds gather in the sky. A bright flash of lightning is seen among the thick clouds, illuminating them with light. Something terrible is coming. The guy lies exhausted on the ground and does not move. Raindrops are dripping directly on him, but he does not pay any attention to it. After a while, he feels someone gently stroking his head, but he doesn't feel it. He is so exhausted. A puddle of rain has collected on the ground. Andreas is squatting in front of him, but the boy doesn't know him. But Andreas recognizes the boy immediately and can't believe his eyes. Slightly removing a strand of hair from his face, Andreas recognizes him. This guy's name is Benjamin Anakis. Benjamin continues to lie on the wet ground. Andreas scrutinizes the boy's face. He didn't think he'd meet a game character in a place like this. The rain kept dripping. Andreas recalls that Benjamin Anakis's main skill is swordsmanship, and he has the Lord of Swords trait. In battle, he is very ferocious. Turning his attention to his back, he immediately realizes that he is wearing his demon sword, Rubens. The sword looks very intimidating. It's huge and very sharp. It's been kept in Benjamin's village for generations. Andreas immediately concludes that since he is here, his settlement is under attack. An army of unknown people wearing strange masks and cloaks hide their faces. They look very strange and frightening. Andreas gets to his feet and looks at Benjamin lying on the ground. He remembers that in the game he was somehow able to escape with a demon sword. He decides he can't pretend he didn't see anything. Ignoring the rain, Andreas decides that he needs the game characters to be indebted to him, and that he can't be left to fend for himself here. The rain has stopped. Andreas sits by the fire he has built, cooking some meat. Not far from him, Benjamin is unconscious, leaning against a rock. Andreas has carefully covered him with a plaid. The fire gives off a pleasant warmth and aroma. After a while, Benjamin regains consciousness and struggles to open his eyes. He looks puzzled, not realizing where he is at this moment. Without turning to face him, Andreas asks him if he's awake as he continues to serenely roast meat on the fire. Benjamin finally comes to his senses and fearfully asks Andreas who he is. His eyebrows are furrowed. Andreas nonchalantly hands him the meat on the spit and offers him something to eat. Benjamin pulls away from him fearfully, stumbling backward. His eyes are wide with fear, his teeth clenched. Andreas looks at him like he's insane as he continues to hold out the meat to him. Benjamin asks him what he's up to. With a nonchalant expression on his face, Andreas tells him to calm down. He tries to explain to him in a calm voice that if he wanted to hurt him, he would already be dead. Suddenly, Benjamin remembers his sword and tries to find it with his eyes. Realizing this, Andreas explains that he needs to eat and regain his strength, because this sword is very important to him, but he needs to get stronger to carry it. A warm memory from his childhood pops into Benjamin's mind. Little Benjamin and his beloved grandfather hang the sword that he carefully carries on the wall, framed by their family's dear one. His brow furrows, his pupils constrict. The memories of it made his chest ache. A little more and he'd cry with grief. The good-natured grandfather and little Benjamin hold up a card with some signs to the sword. An excited little Benjamin looks on, eyes wide open. Benjamin can no longer contain his emotions. He begins to sob loudly with hopelessness. Andreas looks at him silently and notices that he reminds him of Shohei, that he's so emotional, just like in the game. All the while, Andreas continues to hold the meat on the spit in his hand, holding it out to Benjamin. He once again offers him something to eat. Back to reality, Benjamin approaches Andreas to take the meat he offered him and eat it sooner because he is so hungry. Benjamin greedily pounces on the meat. Andreas smilingly looks at him and notes that he can clearly eat. A small flask with some kind of potion appears in his hand, which he offers to Benjamin to get him back to normal. Benjamin greedily eats the meat with tears in his eyes. He is very grateful to Andreas. Andreas watches good-naturedly as Benjamin gorges on the meat and smiles slightly. Suddenly, Andreas feels uncomfortable at being stared at so blatantly. A little embarrassed, he turns away from him. Turning away from Benjamin, he says that he's not a beggar, and that it's rude to sit and stare while someone eats. Looking up, Benjamin shrieks in surprise. Silhouettes in dark cloaks and masks can be seen at the top of the hill. Some of them hover above the ground. Benjamin abruptly grabs his sword, shouting out to the unknown men that they are bastards. Andreas sits silently without getting up from his seat. Unknown masked men stand silently at the top of the hill and watch Andreas and Benjamin. Their masks have holes on them, varying in number. Benjamin recalls a terrible picture. It was the moment they brutally murdered his grandfather, stabbing him from behind with a sword right through his heart. His eyes are bloodshot, tears are pouring out of them. He looks very fierce and he wants payback. Andreas watches Benjamin's actions carefully. He guesses from his reaction that it was these unknown men who attacked his village. Andreas's gaze grows harder. He will not tolerate such injustice. These unsubs are acolytes. They're orphans raised by Jester as his personal assassination squad. They are well-trained physically and in great shape. For some reason, they remind Andreas of his past life, where there were only soldiers around, trained to the level of special forces, and who can even use basic magic. These young guys are like zombifieds who are completely subservient to Jester. And when they get to the point of possessing an aura, Jester gives them a mask that reflects their abilities. Andreas realizes that they are pathetic, but that negotiating with them will not be possible. Suddenly, Benjamin interrupts his train of thought, loudly telling him to stand behind him. Andreas looks at him perplexed. He is amazed at his determination and dedication. Benjamin is ready to tear them all to pieces for revenge for his grandfather and the village he was born and raised in. He sternly tells Andreas that they only have a case against him. Several acolytes loom over him, holding weapons in their hands. They tell him not to joke around like that, calling him a boy. They order him to be obedient and just give them the sword. Benjamin is resolutely advancing to attack with them. His gaze is serious, his eyes are mad, and his teeth are bared. He swings his sword at them. Andreas stands behind him, ready to come to his aid at any moment. Benjamin angrily swings his huge sword, raising dust around him. The Acolans stop and look at him perplexed. It is impossible to read anything on their faces. They begin to form magical orbs around them that allow them to stay safe. Benjamin swings his sword furiously as the acolytes dodge the blows. One of the acolytes, with a dot and cross emblazoned on his mask, looks up somewhere. Benjamin lands a flurry of punches, but he deftly defends against them by setting up his huge sword. The acolytes look at him perplexed, amazed at how he was able to muster the strength to do battle with him. One of them comes close to Benjamin. A sword thrust passes between them. Benjamin is distracted from the fight and turns back. At that moment, he is attacked from behind by two acolytes. Andreas watches worriedly from the sidelines, trying not to get involved, as Benjamin has been doing a great job with the acolytes up to this point. He sees that Benjamin is starting to lose his grip, and he wishes he could say, which is to be expected from the youngest playable character in the game. Benjamin actively tries to defend himself, protecting his sword. Andreas decides that he doesn't see the point of letting him get hurt badly like in the game. One of the Acolans tries to take his precious sword from Benjamin's hands. He gripped the hilt tightly, keeping the sword from him. Since things are taking such a terrible turn, Benjamin can barely control his sword, and with a few strokes he chops the acolytes with it. He screams with all his might because he feels he is starting to lose his strength, but he turns back and sees Andreas laughing to his aid. Andreas decides to end this immediately. He adopted an attack pose while the Acolans stare at him in surprise. Andreas's gaze is full of determination and confidence. He looks at them with unperturbed eyes and gets down to business. The astonished Acolans turn to him and freeze in confusion. They didn't expect that there was anyone left to come to Benjamin's aid, for they had destroyed the entire village. Andreas hears one of the Acolan leaders order the remaining men to take care of him first. He continues to remain unfazed. Keeping an eye on what is to come, he watches each of them carefully, waiting for an attack. The Acolans have no time to get close to him, but he deftly cuts their heads and masks in half with a single swing of his sword. Without much effort, Andreas takes down Benjamin's assailants in no time. He, in turn, stands frozen and watches. He is absolutely stunned by what has just happened. His eyes are wide open, his mouth involuntarily open in amazement. He scrutinizes Andreas and is amazed at how easily he just slaughtered those bastards who attacked his village and killed his grandfather. He continues to scrutinize him, and the bright red light in his eyes begins to slowly fade. After a few seconds, the hatred and anger in his eyes completely disappear, taking on their former appearance. Now they express only mild consternation and admiration. One of the Acolans is still alive, but he falls to the ground, lurching slightly in pain and surprise. A second later, Andreas steps on his face with his mask on and crushes him so that dark blood splatters in different directions. Benjamin watches in amazement from a distance. He continues to look admiringly at Andreas, who is done with the accolades and stands trying to catch his breath. Benjamin wonders about who he is. Andreas puts his sword away on his belt and makes sure it was all Akalina's. He looks around. Benjamin stands not far from him and stands silently looking at Andreas as he continues to faithfully hold his priceless sword in his hands. Andreas stands with his head turned to the side. Benjamin asks himself if he could defend his village if he were as strong. Andreas abruptly turns to face him and asks him if he's okay. Benjamin is taken aback and loudly replies that yes, he is fine. His expression changes to one of bewilderment and slight consternation. He can't find the words to say to his savior. Andreas looks at him smugly and realizes perfectly well that Benjamin's attitude towards him has changed after seeing him fencing. Andreas interrupts the awkward silence and says that he has remembered that he has not introduced himself. He introduces himself to him as Count Andreas Cromwell. Benjamin freezes in place. Stuttering a little, Benjamin calls his name, as if also introducing himself, and opens his mouth wide. Andreas addresses him good-naturedly, asking about what, if he was being chased, if there was a place he could go to. Benjamin scratches the back of his head in thought and can't think of where he should really go now that his village is gone. This is when Andreas realizes that Luis and the other main characters will soon start entering the academy. Images of them and an ingenious plan arise in his mind. He decides to check on them and keep an eye on Benjamin. Andreas strongly suggests that if Benjamin has nowhere else to go, he should teach him fencing. Benjamin was clearly unprepared for this turn of events. He opens his eyes wide in surprise and can't believe his ears. He looks at Benjamin shrilly and admits to him that he cannot let his talents go to waste, for that would be a crime. He tells him to apply for admission to the academy and promises to write a letter of recommendation. Benjamin looks at him confusedly and tries to object. He confesses to him, embarrassed, that he has no money and lowers his head. Andreas decisively tells him that he will cover the cost of his tuition and he has only to decide whether to accept or not. Benjamin can't believe what he's hearing. He opens his eyes wide. Andreas stands with his arms folded across his chest and looks at Benjamin defiantly. He says he has enough money to bear such expenses. Tears come to Benjamin's eyes. He struggles to hold them back. Stammering, he tells Andreas that one day, he falls to his knees and bows his head to Andreas. He promises that he will definitely repay him for his kindness. Andreas confusedly laughs to him to lift him off his knees and explains that you don't have to go that far. Time passes. Andreas sits in a valiant pose on a huge Kremlin and scrutinizes the news in his tablet. He received a letter from Benjamin Anakis. He sincerely thanks him for his letter of praise and for his support. He writes that his excellence has amazing fencing and he really wants to become as strong as him. A confident Benjamin stands in the background of the academy. His specialty is swordsmanship, so he will graduate with no problem. Andreas looks at his picture and mentally advises him to work hard and promises that he will only give him as much money as he needs. Andreas abruptly remembers that he has to get ready for Muriel's auction. He vigorously clicks on the screen of his tablet. He writes to Carlos that he would like to participate in the auction. Carlos in turn asks him if he likes something. Carlos further writes that he will get tickets and that his father will find him another one. Andreas thanks him profusely and suggests that he meet him there tomorrow. Andreas rejoices that he has acquaintances among the great aristocrats. He rests his hand firmly on the edge of the table to stand up and thinks about the fact that now it's time for him to go. The image of the port of Muriel, with white-sailed ships moored to the shore, which is the most lawless entertainment district, comes into his mind. There is some serious dialogue going on in Jester's gloomy castle. He inquires about what has become of Reuben's demonic sword. He is told that the boy has escaped with the sword and that a squad has been sent after him. After pausing for a bit, one of the Akalins dares to inform Jester that they are not back yet. Jester stands by the table and cuts up the body. He is fiercely determined to make sure once again that they let him escape. Akalin sits next to him on his lap and doesn't know what to say to that. Jester thinks of the same demonic sword that increases physical and magical abilities if you pick it up. He planned to study it and create a mass production. A huge demonic sword arises in his mind. It was the one he was looking for to multiply and thus strengthen his army. He thought he had already gotten it, but it slipped out of his hands. Realizing that things aren't going the way he planned, he clutches tightly at the head of the monster he's carving up on the table. In one hand motion, he squeezes his head so that it flattens. Blood splatters flying to the sides. He orders the Akelin to send Hosan to Muriel immediately. Akelin looks at his lord in silence and dares not contradict him. Jester orders him what he tells Hosan to tell him to join Aleb at the auction. Jester imagines in his mind the image of the precious crown of the deep. He is certain that he must get it at any cost. He thinks of Aleb and knows for sure that if he's at the auction, he'll bring her back, even under the most unforeseen circumstances. The port city of Muriel stands on a beautiful riverbank. There are always huge ships at the harbor. Andreas and Carlos are sitting at the table sipping wine from their glasses with pleasure, anticipating a great game and a great catch. The biggest attraction in the entertainment district, Night of the Current Gold, is taking place. Andreas stares intently into the clipboard and sips wine from his glass. His goal is mortal sin, but it is better to take advantage of this opportunity and get his hands on as many named items as possible. Andreas studies the items in the auction and his attention stops on a sword, a white nightmare. It is a famous sword with great mana conductivity. He decides to bid and presses the green button. He thinks about the fact that if he can offer the highest price for it, he will send this sword to Benjamin. Unexpectedly, Carlos interrupts him, moving closer to him. He asks Andreas if he is really that interested in fencing. Andreas, slightly confused, replies to Carol that he would like to give this sword to an acquaintance. Putting his hand to his chin, Carlos says that this sword looks pretty good, and he thinks 20 million isn't enough for it. He offers to raise the bid to 50. Andreas laughs gloatingly and replies that he won't overpay. Andreas looks at Carlos with excitement in his eyes and explains to him that he has only just begun and that the price will gradually rise. The auctioneer shrieks enthusiastically, asking the audience who would give the most. After waiting a while, he thanks everyone and announces that the White Nightmare has sold for 23 million wiles. Carlos looks at Andreas with a smile and remarks that it wasn't bad. Andreas, slightly upset, replies to him that it looks like 20 million would have been enough. The following item appears on the tablet. Andreas stares intently at the screen and examines it thoroughly. The auctioneer tells him that this is a map that many scientists have tried to decipher, but have failed. Andreas is surprised that it is also being auctioned. Andreas thinks about the fact that this secret map leads to the tomb of the terrible and terrifying dragon Kravmak. He thought it was just a passphrase, but it turns out it exists. Different voices are heard from the audience. Some say they will give in this time, some are laughing loudly, and some are sure that deciphering is his specialty. But Andreas knows that the corpses are important to him and that he has to get them. He chooses the green bet button and decides to start with 2 million. Someone bids 5 million. The auctioneer asks the bidders if there are any more bidders. Andreas smiles evilly. He is sure that if he can get his hands on the dragon, it will be equal in power to an entire country. The auctioneer announces that the encrypted map has sold for 5 million wilsas. Andreas smugly clenches his fist and rejoices in the fact that he was able to obtain such a valuable item. Aleb looks back at Andreas and Carlos in amazement and can't figure out who they are. His attention is focused on them. He looks at them angrily and realizes that they have no money. He sits on the other side of the balcony. There's a thick column separating them. He decides it doesn't matter and he wants to play with them. Aleb grinned snidely. To him, the main prize is the crown anyway. He figures the more they spend up to it, the less they can compete with him. The auctioneer announces with excitement that he is moving on to the next item, pointing to a transparent box. It contains a rechargeable teleportation scroll that allows you to move wherever and whenever you want and can be used up to twice a day. Without a moment's hesitation, Andreas presses the green button on the tablet screen. Next, an ancient alchemist's device is offered. It is practical and stylish. Andreas decides to pick it up again. Carlos looks with undisguised amazement at the tasteful Andreas and wonders if he even thinks about what he's buying. The auctioneer announces that the time has come for the long-awaited lot. He advises everyone to be patient. He presents a relic that was pulled from the bottom of the deep sea. Observers are mesmerized, open their mouths, what he will present this time. He intriguingly and slowly introduces the Lord of the Seas to everyone. This is the very crown that Andreas and Jester are after. A gorgeous gold crown with stones is flaunting on the podium. An electronic scoreboard appears in front of Andreas, writing that the purest primal reverie has discovered magnanimous greed. Andreas looks at the lot and realizes that this is exactly what he is here for. The auctioneer informs him that his starting price is 1 billion wills, and the minimum amount to raise is 10. Andreas can't believe his ears. Carlos looks at him with bewilderment. Andreas sadly realizes that this is a rather unpleasant price for him and thinks about how if only he had the money from next month's potion sales. Carlos watches Andreas's reaction carefully and realizes that he doesn't have that kind of money, and he was so excited to pick up the lot. He asks Andreas about wanting that crown too. Andreas, faltering, answers yes. He confusedly explains to Carlos that he wants to offer his amount a couple of times, but if the situation becomes hopeless, he'll just give up. It's very hard for him to realize this. Unexpectedly for Andreas, Carlos good-naturedly tells him that he will buy it for him. Not believing his ears, Andreas asks why he would do such a thing. The smile never leaves his face. Carlos explains that his father briefly told him what happened, about how he was injured in the drains because he was trying to save them. He has a look of gratitude on his face. Andreas absent-mindedly replies that it just happened that way and looks away. He wonders how Bach told him about all this. Carlos taps the tablet screen with frenzied excitement, offering his sum for the crown. He asks Andreas to let him show off the wealth of House Alwyn. Andreas stares at him in silence. Aleb can't believe his eyes. Drops of sweat come to his face. He is amazed that Carlos and Andreas still have the money to continue to participate in the auction. He angrily decides to immediately shut these kids up with the Lord's fortune. He taps the screen of the tablet and offers his sum, 1.5 billion wills. Someone in the auction offers 2 billion wills by tapping on the screen. The two with glasses are also betting their vast fortunes in hopes that this crown will go to one of them. The auctioneer announces that the next bid is 7 billion wills. Andreas realizes that this is an outrageous amount of money. The auctioneer reports that the bid has risen to 8 billion and 7 million wills. Bidders of the auction are actively fighting for such a valuable lot. The auctioneer admiringly reports that the amount has reached 10 billion. Carlos gets up from his chair and realizes that things are taking an interesting turn. He is not ready to give up and decides to go all the way. Andreas looks at him with admiration. As he looks at Carlos with admiring eyes, he thinks about how he still loves to compete as much as he did when he was a kid. The auctioneer points his hand somewhere and cheerfully says that since they are in this position, they better win, and he'll be sure to repay them. Waving his hands, the auctioneer announces that the amount has reached 50 billion wills. The people in the audience look at him attentively. The auctioneer asks the participants if anyone is willing to offer more. Carlos didn't hesitate to offer 70 billion. Not a single vein on his face trembled. He is still gambling. Andreas looks at his clipboard and his face is covered with drops of sweat. The auctioneer loudly announces that the next amount is 90 billion wills. There's a real commotion in the building. Seconds later, the auctioneer announces that someone has bid 100 billion wills. Aleb laughs gloatingly. All the veins on his forehead are swollen, drops of sweat running down his face. Suddenly, he wonders if he should go any farther. He recalls Jester's words that he absolutely has to get the crown, no matter how much it would cost. Biting his lower lip, Aleb touches his head with his hand. He realizes that no matter how much money the gentleman has, it's too much. He doesn't know what he should do. He realizes that he should have asked how much money he can spend. Suddenly, he hears about the auctioneer thanking someone and that the Lord of the Seas has been sold for 100 billion wills. Aleb shrieks loudly, opening his mouth wide. Drool spurts from his mouth, snot dripping from his nose. Suddenly, he hears someone giggling behind him, telling him that he had done something wrong. Aleb turns around and sees Hosan standing behind him with his arms folded across his chest. A man in tight robes stands and stares at Aleb nonchalantly. He tells him that he is sure the master sent him here, as a wimp like him would definitely not have completed the task. Aleb looks at him fearfully. A strange makeup can be seen on Hosan's face and an unusual cape on his head. He goes on to tell Aleb that even if he could win by betting over 100 billion wills, he would be killed for such a thing. Hosan orders him to go back and wait. Hosan looks at Andreas and Carlos carefully and says that he doesn't know who the people are who won the crown in the auction. His face takes on a vicious and bloodthirsty look. He decides that he will let them savor the taste of victory before he dies. Carlos guesses that he will probably be scolded when he returns. Despite this, he talks about how he is starving and calls Andreas to go get something to eat. Andreas replies to him that Carlos has shown him the Alwyn family's wealth in full force. The lights are shining brightly in a beautiful building with golden frames on the windows. It is night outside. Andreas puts the Lord of the Sea's crown on his head. He hears loud laughter. He doesn't feel very good about it. Carlos stands in front of him and laughs loudly at him. He tells him, calling him Your Highness, which suits him just fine. Andreas is not pleased that Carlos is treating the codex like a toy, but he remains indulgent, since he is the one who bought it for him. Andreas and Carlos are sitting at a large table across from each other. Their table is set in a gorgeous way. Carlos suggests that Andreas make a toast and celebrate. They clink glasses with the pink drink. Andreas thanks Carlos for everything. Andreas sips his drink and thinks about the fact that, thanks to Carlos, he was able to get greed without being in danger, and it looks like the meeting hasn't made its move yet, as we can now leave with... There's loud yelling outside the door. The guard asks someone who they think they are, and loudly yells that they can't go in there. Andreas and Carlos look suspiciously toward the entrance to the hall. The large front door is kicked in with tremendous force. A loud bang is heard. Several men in cloaks, led by Hosan, enter the hall. Smirking, they approach the table where Andreas and Carlos are sitting. He asks them snidely about him interrupting their dinner. Carlos asks them who they are, getting up from the table. Andreas recognizes them and mentally notes that they are light on their feet. Hosan approaches them confidently. The broken door is lying on either side of them. Hosan, with a sly smile on his face, comes closer and closer to them and tells them to give up the crown, and that this way they will die without pain. His army follows him. Andreas realizes that their business is bad. His face takes on a wan look. Andreas looks closely at Hosan and realizes that he is Jether's dog. He realizes that although he can't use the arcane arts now, he is as strong as the Master of Aura. Andreas recalls Deshroon's fierce face and his words about Hosanna. He said about him that he was very arrogant because of his talent, and he used to fight with his mentor, that is, with him all the time. Eventually he left and went straight into the underworld where Jester is now. Jester and Hosan are standing back to back. They look intimidating. At one time, Jester noticed his talent and hired him. Andreas clutches his bag tightly. At this moment, he thinks about the fact that he was so hopeful that he could quietly get the crown and go. Andreas timidly looks at Carlos and tells him that their business is bad. He suggests that he just run away from here. Carlos answers him firmly that they will not do that. Hosan laughs slyly and tells them he won't let them go. He has a bloodthirsty grin. He orders his army to take Andreas and Carlos immediately. At that very second, the Accolans go on the offensive. In their hands are sharp swords. Carlos and Andreas violently smash the window so that shards fall in different directions. The Accolines catch up with them. Hosan stares after them as they quickly move off into the distance. Hosan stands looking gloatingly at Andreas and Carlos disappearing into the distance. He coolly notes that they did the right thing, thus not making his task too easy, or he would have died of boredom. In the depths of the forest, it's pitch black. A river flows in the deepest part of the forest. A small dock with a boat is visible on the bank. Somewhere nearby, you can hear the voices and grins of Andreas and Carlos approaching. As they make their way through the thick bushes, Carlos and Andreas spot the very same dock. Carlos notes that everything is working out perfectly, and that Hosan and his army won't be able to catch up with them if they cross the river. Carlos decisively climbs into the boat and tells Andreas that Muriel is a lawless land beyond the Emperor's power, but once they get the hell out of here, there's nothing those guys can do. Andreas asks him to go on without him and get someone to help. A surprised Carlos doesn't know what he's talking about. Andreas, turning back, explains to him that it will not be easy to escape from them, and that it is too dangerous to move together, and that it will be easier for him to escape alone. An indignant Carlos sighs deeply and says that Andreas is being his usual. Carlos agrees to Andreas's offer and sets off from the shore in a boat. He tells him that he will try to bring someone to help as soon as possible. Andreas thanks him and tells him that they will see each other soon. Andreas stands on the dock and watches Carlos sail away. He is calm now, knowing that Carlos is safe. After a while, he hears behind his back that someone is shouting loudly that they found him. Andreas smiles slyly and is pleased that he can now hold himself back since Carlos isn't around. An army of Akalans flank the dock, the Hosan standing behind them. Andreas stands nonchalantly with his back to them. They wonder where the other kid is and assume Andreas has the crown. Andreas drops his bag on the floor and replies firmly that he has the crown, offering to try and take it away from him. With a confident smile on his face, Andreas glares at them and pulls his sword from his belt. Outraged to the extreme, the acolytes pull out their guns and ask him about how he dare laugh at them. They quickly approach Andreas, spreading their arms out to the sides and holding their sharp swords and daggers. They shout loudly to him that they will chop him to pieces. Andreas swings his sharp sword in cold blood, bouncing and moving vigorously in different directions. His movements are coherent and well thought out. One of the Akalans jumps high above the ground and wants to pounce on Andreas. He skillfully dodges it. Suddenly, Andreas shouts out the word Rudrudol. After saying the word, his eyes fill with a bright light and take on an even more serious look. Not realizing what's happening, Hosan looks up from his side and realizes that Andreas has cast an undead summoning spell. Hosan's look becomes a frown. While Andreas is massacring an army of enemies, a huge giant Rudrudol appears behind him. The Akalines fly in different directions in pieces. Not understanding what's going on here, the acolytes stare questioningly at what's going on without taking their eyes off. A huge hand appears in the sky. They raise their heads upward in horror and realize that their affairs are not good. While they stare upward mesmerized, Andreas approaches them and sinks his sharp sword into their bodies. As he does so, he smiles and caustically advises them to try not to get distracted. While Andreas successfully massacres a huge army of Akalans by swinging his sword, Hosan looks on indignantly from the sidelines. Hosan smiles slyly and notes that Andreas is not only strong in dark magic, but also excellent with a sword. He notices that he is a very interesting kid and marvels at his swordsmanship technique.